Are leading off our discussion tonight with experts on both aspects of this story, the legal and the political. Ari Melber has crossover jurisdiction in both of those territories, the legal and the political. He's MSNBC's chief legal correspondent and host of The Beat, weeknights at 6 p.m. here on MSNBC. John Heilemann will consider the politics of the Mueller report as it lands in Congress in the middle, lest we forget, of a presidential campaign. He is a national affairs analyst for NBC News and MSNBC. He is co-host and executive producer of Showtime's The Circus. We have two Justice Department veterans with us tonight who will give us their reading of the Mueller report. Joyce Vance is a former U.S. attorney and a professor at the University of Alabama School of Law. She is an MSNBC legal contributor. And William Yeoman spent 26 years in the Justice Department and was former chief counsel on the Senate Judiciary Committee. He now serves as a senior fellow at the Alliance for Justice. And Ari, let me start with you. This, as I think, is your 9th hour of television today. I've lost track. I've been following you all day. For quite a while. Most of what I knew about this, I'd learned from you on television. I've caught up with my reading. Given everything that's been analyzed today, what do you think the focus should be now?
Well, as you say, Lawrence, the day is long, but not nearly as long as the Mueller report. You just laid out something that was so vital, and you did it as we've come to expect in a narrative fashion, but it has great legal significance, as you know, because when the president says, oh, there's going to be a fact-finding query into me and what I've done as president or in my life, so my presidency is over, I'm effed. Bob Mueller doesn't include that in a report this serious for headlines. If Bob Mueller wanted headlines, he would have sought headlines over the last 23 months. He did the opposite. Everyone knows that. Tight-lipped, no leaks during the probe, and certainly no exciting little tidbits. I submit to you that while that is exciting and it makes for great prose, as you just read, it's in there because of the legal significance, because it tells us about the potentially alleged corrupt intent in the president's mind. And that goes to the mystery that animates all of this that we've learned a bit more about thanks to this report today. And I would put it like this. If there was no chargeable election conspiracy, why would the president do so many things that amount to evidence of obstruction? So much evidence of obstruction that Mueller says, look, he says this near the end, if we found someone who didn't obstruct at all, we would tell you that. We're not telling you that. So why? Well, one of the answers that is basically gestured at in that amazing quote is that the president was knowledgeable of his own criminal liability and exposure, but maybe not for the election conspiracy, maybe for, as you mentioned, other election crimes that he knew about that were covered up in New York, maybe for one of the other referrals that remains under investigation, maybe because the Trump Tower meeting or the WikiLeaks contact that he had is the beginning and not the end, and so he knew of other things that in his long and litigious experience gave him knowledge of his own criminal liability. It was not the private announcement or saying of a person who thought, I'm clear, this will be a headache, give it time. It was the statement, raw, uncut, unvarnished, off Twitter, as you say, of a man who seemed very acquainted with his criminal liability.
And John Heilemann, Trump is the one person who knows everything. He knows what he did with Michael Cohen in the closing weeks of the campaign that has now been judged criminal. He might not necessarily have known that that crossed legal lines, but what he did know is, I don't want that public. And he also knew once a prosecutor starts looking at you, they can look at anything.
Yes, and look, I mean, we often have had conversations about whether Donald Trump is in the full possession of his faculties. So there may be some things that Donald Trump has done that he does not fully remember. I can't speak to his state of mind. A lot of people speculate about it, but there's no doubt that Ari's point is right, and it is a dramatic moment. It is a moment in which, to your point earlier, Trump recognizes the profound political peril that he's in. And everything that happens, I think, from that moment forward, so much of the obstruction part of this report that details owes from that. He thinks, really for the first time, he's in existential peril, and he's right. He may still be right, not only that his presidency has been captive to this politically, that it's been hamstrung by it, that he's been beaten about the head and shoulders by Bob Mueller, by Democrats, by all of the critics that have attacked him, but it's still, to me now, as a political matter, if it's right, that as we all directly read in the report and surmise from the tone of the report, that Mueller's intention was to say, I understand that I can't indict a sitting president according to Justice Department policy. I'm an institutional conservative. I'm not going to challenge that. I'm not going to go to the Supreme Court and try to see if we can set new precedent on that matter. What I am going to do is I'm going to push this into the political realm. The political realm is the proper realm for this is Congress, where we don't talk about crimes in the purely criminal court sense. We talk about crimes, high crimes and misdemeanors. And here is, in the way that Leon Jaworski did in Watergate, here is a roadmap to Congress for things that could, in a democratic polity, be considered high crimes and misdemeanors. Guys, have at it. And so tonight, where we are in the political realm is a Democratic House of Representatives that faces a giant choice of of how to proceed. Impeachment is now fully on the table. The answer may be that Democrats decide they don't want to go down that path, or they want to try to go partway down that path and then decide later, or that they want to, as Steny Hoyer seemed to suggest tonight, doesn't want to go down that path at all. But that is the salient political issue: are we going down that road or not? And that is a matter that is fully in the hands of Democrats who now control the House of Representatives.
Let me stay with you on that for one point, because there's a couple of elements to it, and the most elementary part of it, forget the politics of is it good for the Democrats or bad for the Democrats. By the way, one of the things I find so strange coming from the Democratic side is the fear that it's bad for the Democrats. Because why? Because the impeachment of Bill Clinton was bad for the Republicans? Who really thinks that? The Republicans then won the House of Representatives, they then won the Senate, and they won the presidency. How did it hurt them? Someone explain that to me. But the calendar, the political calendar, we're a year and a half away from a change of administrations if President Trump loses re-election. To mount an impeachment process, you might not get to an impeachment vote in the House of Representatives until, say, Thanksgiving at the earliest of this year. You then move to a trial in the Senate, and now you've got the Iowa caucuses and New Hampshire primary and a impeachment trial in the Senate going on, and people are thinking, wait a minute, isn't the election close enough to solve this problem? So the calendar is a practical problem that crashes up against the issue of impeachment.
It is, and it's also, we don't have what we had in 1974. We don't have the smoking gun. We don't have a set of tapes that have caused what would make this an easy political choice: a sudden crumbling of Republican support for the president, the country turning against the president with his approval ratings cratering. We've not seen that, and I don't think we're going to see that on the basis of this report. As a frank matter, the president's base is likely to hold, and so therefore it's a much trickier political calculation. Again, putting even aside the things you just laid out, is there a way it could work for Democrats or not? There's an urgency to it, because in some world you might want to say, let's kick the can down the road. Let's tie the president up in investigations that are interminable, make his life miserable, and then we'll figure out the impeachment thing in due course. Unfortunately, in due course, the first Democratic debates are in June. They're 6 weeks away. We're starting to hear people, even fierce opponents of the president's, who are saying the right thing to do right now is to settle this at the election at the voting booth.
Joyce Vance, with this calendar on the impeachment question, doesn't that strike you as something? To me, it's the invisible factor in the Mueller report. As I'm reading it, and Mueller says at a certain point that he's not going to subpoena the president because it's so late in the investigation. Well, investigations don't have calendars normally; they have kind of unlimited calendars. But it strikes me that the calendar Robert Mueller had in mind was, in fact, a presidential election, and he did not want to infect a presidential election by letting his work and his investigation run that far down the calendar. And that's one of the reasons why he skipped the subpoena process of the president, which would have taken several months.
It's hard to know for sure, but there's a long-standing DOJ policy that says that we shouldn't have investigations that impact elections. And of course, this case is the poster child for that. There is, I think, no practical way that that decision about the president's testimonial status could have been decided by the Supreme Court without bumping heads with the timing on the election. And Mueller may have felt something else here. It's not something that prosecutors often feel, but there's some indication that he felt urgency to bring the facts in front of the American people. He knew all along he would not be indicting a sitting president because of DOJ policy. And so rather than kicking the can down the road in this regard, I think he was simply trying to get evidence into the hands of the people who constitutionally were the folks charged with making a decision about what to do with it.
William Yeomans, that evidence is in their hands now. What does Congress do next? With your experience working on the Hill and your experience in the Justice Department, what do you see happening next?
Well, I think the House Judiciary Committee has to start a series of very aggressive hearings. As you point out, there isn't a lot of time. and the administration is going to try to run out the clock. I think they've already announced that they will resist every request for information, every subpoena that they get from Congress. They are denying the constitutional role of Congress in oversight and investigations. So their goal clearly is to get this beyond the election and to get it to what I think Joyce was just referring to, which is a period before the election when it's going to be difficult for anybody to do much of anything. So I think it's imperative for the Judiciary Committee to start right away with a series of very aggressive hearings. They do have the roadmap here. They have a wonderful start. They know who to get in there. And they need to do it. They need to do it now.
And Ari, aggressive hearings, to my mind, especially based on what we saw today with the Attorney General, would mean skipping the Attorney General hearing. That's just a formal procedure because they're the Judiciary Committee, Committee of Jurisdiction of the Justice Department. They always like to talk to the head guy. That seems like a tradition to dispense with here. That seems like a wasted day and a wasted amount of time in getting to Mueller. They will get to Mueller weeks after Barr. Why not just skip Barr and get to Mueller as soon as you can?
Well, I suppose the reason to get to Barr is what you and Rachel were talking about. The notion that Sessions was on the hook for perjury was because he'd been held to account, right, in that sort of setting. But I agree with your premise. That's not the point. It's not the fireworks. Getting Mueller and perhaps his deputies or going through every single one of his prosecutors to dig into this stuff can be very important. The Cohen testimony was important for the American public. The nothing matters arguments that we heard throughout this probe, and now that Mueller's done the fair job, which means, what does fairness sometimes mean? It means there are things in here some people like and things some people don't like. That's why he's such a fair, careful prosecutor. But the nothing matters argument, that is the argument of the depraved, of the people who want to get away with everything. So while I understand that it's part of our job to cover, well, what would a calendar of impeachment look like? There's also the let's not get ahead of the fact finding that Congress does with this now, as you put it, as the roadmap to have Mueller and other people in and go through it all. The other point that's very important, whether or not Congress takes the maximum approach or not, is the President of the United States is the one person in our system of government who has the constitutional obligation to take care that the laws be faithfully executed.
Yes.
That's what it says in the Constitution. We've had so much talk about the fact that for other reasons, we don't indict sitting presidents typically, that I think sometimes folks can just lose a little bit of the headline here, which is if there is overwhelming evidence of obstruction by the president, that is worse than if it was by a regular citizen, even though, yes, you have to hold two thoughts in your mind. We have a system that doesn't indict the sitting president. And that is what is on the table here that the Congress has to deal with. A president who stands credibly accused of doing that over and over, putting himself above the country.
Joyce Vance, we all had some things we wondered about in the Mueller report, especially after the Barr letters started to come out, things that we struggled to make sense of, like why didn't Mueller reach a conclusion? Having read it today, do you feel like it answers all of those questions that we had about what was really happening here?
Something that surprised me when I started reading was actually how well some of the analysis based on the Barr letter held up. And that might sound surprising, but what I mean by that is that when we read between the lines of Barr's initial letter, we saw that he wasn't saying that the campaign had not engaged in any sort of conspiracy with Russians. Instead, it seemed that he had been very narrow, and he had said that there was not evidence that established that. We saw that repeated in the Mueller report today, where Mueller says there was not sufficient evidence and, in fact, talks about some ways where evidence was hard to come by. People took the fifth. Witnesses lied. Some of the evidence was unavailable because it was in the possession of people who were out of the country. And there's even this reference where Mueller says, you know, this is the judgment that we make here, but because we couldn't get all of the evidence, because there were gaps in the evidence, it's possible that some of what we've concluded here could be different if we'd had access to the evidence. So the president doesn't get indicted. People around him in the campaign don't get indicted. But it's pretty slender hope. It's not really a strong bill of health. And then we have something similar that happens on obstruction, where it was very clear from Barr's initial letter that there was no intent for Barr to make the ultimate decision. You know, Barr characterized it as binary. You're a prosecutor. You have to say yes or no. Reading the report, though, it's clear that what we summarized all along, that Mueller declined to make a decision because of DOJ policy against indicting a sitting president, that was in fact the case. And Mueller writes a beautiful roadmap for Congress to pick up and investigate with.
And Bill Yeomans, the Attorney General seems to be extremely careful in what he writes. You can take what he writes, including his written statement this morning. You look back on it and you see, oh, I see how he threaded the needle. But then when it's verbal and he's just in exchanges in hearings or today with reporters, he said no collusion. This report does not say no collusion. This report says, if you're going to use the word collusion, in effect what it says is there could be, and there were a bunch of things that sure looked like collusion. We couldn't get the proof of this up to proof beyond a reasonable doubt for a courtroom.
Yeah, it was stunning that the Attorney General stayed with the term collusion. And obviously he was playing to his audience in the White House, in the Oval Office. But the report could not be more clear that the investigation was not addressing collusion. It was addressing the issue of a criminal conspiracy or coordination, which it defined as something close to a conspiracy. And there is a lot in the report that certainly satisfies my definition of collusion. For instance, where we have Paul Manafort and Gates sitting down with Konstantin Kilimnik to give, to do an inside strategy discussion on the Trump campaign and to talk about the battleground states and to share internal polling. That seems to me to be collusion. So I think there are a number of examples in the report that satisfy the collusion standard to the extent collusion is relevant.
John Heilemann, in terms of if you're watching the movie of this, the character you want to track probably more than any other is Don McGahn. He is the one who is in the scenes with the president where the president is saying, fire the special prosecutor, fire Mueller. And this is days after Mueller has been chosen. He comes back to it more than once. He calls him at home. He says to him, call me back when you've done it, all these things. And McGahn, at certain points, decides not to tell other people. Not only does he not do it, but and Mueller, by the way, judges him to be a credible witness. He offers that judgment right in writing. Not only does he not do it, but he doesn't even tell other people about it because he doesn't want them to be caught in the web where they will sometime have to answer for this. And so McGahn is the one who basically presents it to Priebus and others simply by saying the president is asking him to do crazy crap, and I cleaned that up. And the crazy crap he's talking about would be crimes in any reading of it.
Yeah, right. And look, I mean, I think what we learn about Don McGahn in this is that he's a very. Anybody who had any questions about his understanding of the intersection of law and politics
and crime.
Yeah. Well, that's what I mean by law. Yeah. The criminal risk and the nexus of political risk and criminal risk. He is doing things that are quite extraordinarily careful to make sure that he keeps other people out of trouble. You could make various judgments about what his moral standing was and what you would have done in a more heroic version of the movie. But there's no doubt that it's extraordinary the number of scenes in which he's involved where the question of obstruction, again, in any layman's understanding, it's like, that looks a lot like obstruction of justice to me.
Can I add something to that? The criminal code, as you know, Lawrence, is all about... Oh, I'm being told we're out of time.
No, finish.
It's all about what you intend to do. I try to follow your producer. In my meaning, if you accidentally leave the oven on and the house goes up in flames and, God forbid, people burn to death, that is very different than arson. Mm-hmm. It's all about what you're trying to do. Both sections of this report show the president and his team trying to get foreign help, but not always succeeding, and then the president trying to shut down the probe in ways that his own lawyer thought would be illegal, quote, Saturday Night Massacre, and he stops him. So the criminal intent there and the negative attempt to do things that might be criminal is suffused throughout the report, even though there's also good news for some of Trump's folks because people stopped him. That is something America needs to take in and consider.
This is page after page of Donald Trump trying to break the law, basically.
We're going to have to leave it there. Ari Melber gets the last word in our opening extended round here. Ari, thank you for your service all day today. John Heilemann, Ari Melber, Joyce Vance, Bill Yeomans, thank you all for starting us off. We really appreciate it. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.